This is Grumpy Bagnall, and he's reminiscing, talking about what we call the olden days, or you call the older days, that we grew up in. Some of the people I knew and some of the things that I did during the course of my life, why I did them and why they were important to me. Steve has asked me to say a little bit, and Anna also has suggested, but I say a little bit about Sue and how we got along. I've told stories about getting engaged and how her brother did it for me and this business, but that's part of it. And but some of the instances in our lives, they're just incidents. But what kind of a woman was she? She was, as far as I'm concerned, the most outstanding woman in my life. No questions asked. Us the greatest blessing that the Lord ever bestowed upon me was my wife. And here I left Alabama with no thought in the world of ever marrying her. In fact, I was glad to be leaving, not her, but going back to Maine. And but somebody else entered the picture. The good Lord steered me in different directions, and we wound up married. And little snippets out of our life might be of interest to you. I can remember we lived in an upstairs apartment. It was about all we could afford. We didn't have any money. We got to Thomaston, Maine, and one of the men out at the plant said, "Look, I know where there's an apartment. It's right on Main Street." So we said, "That's fine." Well, it wasn't the best in the world. It had a kitchen, it had a window that looked out, it had a living room that looked outdoors. It had a middle room, which was the biggest room in the apartment, but it had no windows at all in it, and it had a toilet in the corner of it, drape around it. So when you had guests, at that time, we the young people around, we made friends with, and that was where we had to entertain them or something. To go to bed, you had to go out in the hallway and walk down the hall, and the room behind the living room then was the bedroom. There was another bedroom, or another apartment on the other side of the hallway. And to go to the bathroom, it was right at the end of the hall and served both apartments, all of which was fine. But the thing that I found amusing, and I still do, was that they used to put pulleys and hook clotheslines to them in the backyards, and you would hang your clothes on these, and the pulley would run the clothes out across the backyard. We lived up on the third story, actually, of this building. It was a two-story building, but there was a basement. And it was 3 stories high back there. And I would go home, and Sue we used cloth diapers in those days. She washed them out by hand, which she did right in the bathtub, hands and knees, and wash Charlie's diapers, as it turns out. And then she would lean out this window 3 stories high and hook the diapers onto this reel and reel of you. Look at our backyard. Looks like we had the cleanest kid in the world or the dirtiest, whichever you would determine it. But her working it on her hands and knees, leaning out that window 3 stories high to hang out the baby's diapers. Yeah. An instance. One of the first things when we got to Thomaston, we had been up to see my folks in Holton, Maine. Came back and we'd had a wicked snowstorm. And you couldn't even see where the driveways or anything were. The house next door had two concrete pillars that stood on either side of the driveway. And I said, hon, you hang on because I'm going to get the car off the road. And that's where I'm going to put it. I said, I'm going to go between those two poles because I know there's a driveway and there's a culvert between those things. And we did. So we plowed through the snow and as far as the car would go, just left it there. I said, we'll shovel her out later. Got into the apartment and no food. We didn't have anything in there. And I said, I guess I'd better run uptown. She said, I'd love to go up with you. And I said, all you got is those shoes to wear.
Her Alabama shoes.
Yes, Alabama shoes. And I said, look, I've got an idea. I've got my Army combat boots that I'm going to wear around in the outside. And what we would do is stuff the toes full of socks. And you put them on so they won't be terribly big. And we'll go up to the store. And that's what we did. She wanted to go so badly. And we did. I could picture her today going over the drifts on the sidewalk and street and everything else. We lived practically on Main Street, right up close to the stores and things. And but here she was a real gamer. She plodded up there and lifted those boots and climbed over snowdrifts, and we got what we wanted and took it back to the apartment. But it ties in with another grocery story, grocery store story that I remember. She's from the South now, and she knows Southern ways and does Southern things. She went in one day to get some salt pork. And she walked in and she saw it in the meat counter in there. She said, I'd like a half pound of fat meat.
White meat.
Pardon?
White meat.
White meat.
Yeah.
And the fellow scratched his head a little bit. He knew enough of her to realize that she was from away, And he said, I'm sorry, but we just don't have any. Well, Sue, rather than getting an argument with him and say that you do have fat meat, she said, instead she stood back and waited until somebody come in and bought some fat pork. And then she walked up and she said, I'd like a half pound of fat pork. Just like a native, But, they got a kick out of her. We wanted some grits. And she went up to the store one day and she said, do you have any grits here? And the grocer said, yeah, we do. Let me get it for you. But I want to warn you, it's been there about 8 years. Nobody has ever touched it since we put it there. But it's the only one that I know of that anybody has got. He said, it's old, I don't know if there are bugs in it or anything. But she had a lot to learn, and she learned it. She fit in, and everybody loved her because she would ask for different things like that, and then step back and learn what she was asking for. So that was one of our snow trips, first snow trips probably that she had ever really seen a lot of snow in her life. And here she had these boots and she went to the store and those things. It was a riot. She did it, no complaints. There was another snow incident. We had good friends. A fraternity brother of mine happened to be a lawyer up in Holton, Forest Barnes, and his wife Ann, both of them had gone to Colby. And we went up to visit my mother and dad and home. And the barn said, why don't we go down to Grand Lake? Here it is, it's the middle of the winter. Camps all closed everywhere. And we will go in, light a fire in the fireplace in there, and we will cook steaks over the fireplace in there. And it'll warm, the fireplace will warm the place up enough if we stay in front of the fireplace. And so that's what we decided to do. She said, of course, we're going to have to go across the field in order to get down to the camp because the driveway going in hasn't been plowed and won't be till spring. I said, fine, do you have any snowshoes? Well, the course Forrest did have snowshoes. He had everything under the sun. He'd grown up there in Maine. His father was a lawyer and Forrest was going into the same business. And so we got snowshoes together. An incident which I haven't recited here today. I had my introduction to snowshoes with the Barnes clan and a bunch of other people from Colby. And, but that's another story for my next life. So there were snowshoes. I had been on them before. I'm no expert or anything, but I realized that you had to aim the toes of the snowshoes sort of out, or you were going to step on the edge of your snowshoe and down you would go, and all this business. And I explained a little bit about how to do that, and I said, don't plan on stepping with these things. Lift the front end up with your toes and scoot it along. Drag the tail through the snow. It'll help keep your direction going where you want it to go. So we started off across the field, and Ann and Sue sort of dwindled behind us, and the snow was deep. And about halfway across that field, we heard Ann holler, said, I need help back here. Sue had stepped on the edge of one of the snowshoes and gone over. Well, your first instinct is to put out your hands. Well, the snow was deeper than her arms were long. Here she was face down in the snow. No purchase to put her hands on, to push herself up and tangled in snowshoes. Oh. So Forrest and I went back and got a hold of her and lifted her up out of the snow and stood her up again. Game as she was, she continued on with the snowshoes. We had a great time, as we always did at the Barnes cottage. But her incidents learning about snow were rather dramatic. They were funny to us, but to her they must have been a little bit embarrassing. But they are what ingratiated her to so many of the people up here. Mm-hmm. She was game, she was willing to try it, and she learned. At this point, I would swing to a period of time that we lived in Arbutus, Maryland. Mm-hmm. And to try to explain what things Sue and I had in common. She had grown up down south. Her people were coal miners. Her dad was a mechanic in the coal mines. And her in-laws were logging contractors and different people of this nature. Lovely people. But that's the background that she came out of. And how we ever hooked up and knew that we had common interests, I can't honestly say. But we fit together like gloves on a hand. And what I like to do, she liked to do, or was willing to do it with me and learn whether she liked it or not. I never thought about it. But we did it together. And we used to be extremely active. in the churches. We were in all the churches that we moved to. We were head of the youth group. And we also were counselors to the Boy Scout troop and everything else. But on one occasion, we just camped out. And this was one of the things that she liked to do. She had been in the woods. She had logging contractors down in Utah, Alabama. So she was familiar with being outside and knew that there were snakes and everything else. But in Maine, you don't have poisonous snakes. So we used to just take our sleeping bags, maybe a little pack sack, and we would go up on top of the Appalachian Trail and sleep under the stars. And it was a matter of just rolling out the sleeping bag, or if you had a pup tent, you'd set that up. But sleeping under the stars meant you didn't have anything other than the sleeping bag. And you slept in that, and you could sit there, and you could see the trees up above you, and you could see the sky up there. It was beautiful. It was a lovely place to live in our beauties, because we had a trail like that that was close to us, and in a half hour you could be up in the Appalachian Trail. We had quite a large group, so you could do some interesting things. Yeah. But again, Sue and I were active in every one of these things together. We always went together. We always chaperoned kids and led them and counseled them or whatever they needed. We went hiking on the Appalachian Trail with the Boy Scouts. And the way that we handled it, we had quite a lot of equipment. We'd haul tent up there, and we would have the food that they were going to eat and various things. The Scouts were going to go off about Harper's Ferry and take the trail there and walk it to the other end, which I don't know, might have been 4 or 5 miles, and come to a highway that took you back down to Arbutus or Baltimore or wherever you were going, or Frederick, Maryland. And what the women did, or Oscar and the women, Oscar being Oscar Simon, had this great big troop tent, and he and the girls put the thing up close to the arrival place of the discharge end of the trail. And that's where the Scouts would wind up after they'd been there. Or that's what we thought. And Oscar and I and the 2 women, we managed to sleep in the tent at night. There wasn't a long walk one way or the other, nice trail up there. And we slept in that. But here was a trip that we'd made with the Boy Scouts. And I've got to admit, we worked hard up there. We had that great troop of kids, all of which had to be herded and get into the camping spot. And we realized they were not going to be able to get to our camp down their tent. Our plan had been, it was for the women to transport from one end of the trail to the other end of the trail with cars, so that they could have whatever equipment they needed in the spot where they needed it. And but it didn't work out. And the kids went back down the trail to Harper's Ferry, and there was a field down there. And I knew about how the boys must feel at this point. They were tired, because I was bushed as I have ever been, and I was not all that foreign to carrying equipment around and working in the woods and all this business. But I said, well, again, this is one of our show-off notes. But the field was pretty good. And everybody was coming to the end of the field, and they could see the other scouts down there. And all the other scouts would cheer, you know, that you made it to the field, and they were getting ready the girls to come down along the trail and pick us up and take us back to our beavers. But I said, I'm going to show them. And as tired as I was, with the pack on my back and everything else, when I broke into the clearing in the field, I ran. I didn't want trailing or walking anymore. I just said, I'm going to show them. And I said, I've still got this much left. And I ran all the way down. They almost had to catch me. But
you could start, but stopping was tough.
Yeah, that was another trip that we had up there.
Yeah.
Another one that I remember vividly, the Methodist Church had a camp up on the Appalachian Trail. It was known as Camp Manadokin. And if you wanted to use it from our church, you just simply reserved it, went up, and you were there. And if you had a kitchen in it, everything in it, one end the boys would stay, the other end of the thing was set up for the girls and blah, blah. And so I think, made 2 or 3 trips up and stayed at Camp Manadokin. It was a nice, nice place. And it was fun to go. And you didn't have strays all over the mountainside up there. They were confined pretty much to inside the camp itself. But one evening, they decided that we would tell ghost stories. So all the girls and everybody gathered around in the living room, and they asked me to tell stories. And I said, what kind of a story do you want to hear? And they finally decided they wanted to have ghost stories, horror stories. And I said, okay, I'll tell you one. I said, this will be the last one, and we can all go to bed. And I had talked to one of the older boys and said, this is going to be a setup so that it'll be part of the story. I said, they'll never forget it. So we went in there, and I told them the story about this maniac that I had heard on the radio had escaped from the prison down in somewhere and was roaming around in that area. He had been for days, you know. And, well, all this was fine. They were all listening, and I said, now, we're finishing up. We won't be doing the things as a group. I said, you need to remember, if you're outside, take somebody with you. And I said, I'm sure you're perfectly safe, but this guy is crazy. You don't know what he's going to do. And along deeply into the story, people were huddled in around my storytelling thing, you know, and I was just laying it on in good shape. And the door of the camp burst open, and this fella came through, and he had an axe in his hand. And come rushing in, and we'd put this up, you know. But I learned more from that than they did. He finally laid everything down. Everybody knew that it was a joke. But one of the girls was petrified. She panicked. It scared her to death, and we could not get her to calm down. I thought we were in deep trouble. But we finally, the whole group, got together and explained that this was part of the trip, and it was fun part. The rest of them they either had fathomed it or accepted it once they knew what was
Right.
happening, you know. But that was one trip I remembered in Manidokan that I learned more from the trip than they did. I had the opportunity while I was there to be offered a teaching position, and I always had thought that what I'll eventually do is become a teacher in colleges where I wanted to teach. And down at Shepherd College, they had a man in charge of the science department, but he didn't have a geology class. And he sent word, I've forgotten just exactly how, up to me at work one day and said, would you be willing to come down and talk to me? So I went down to talk to him, figuring he wanted me to come in and talk to one of his classes or something. And he said, we're trying to make a bigger science department here at Shepherd than we've had. And would you be interested in coming in and teaching geology? And I said, well, I've got a job. I said, I work all day. I said, if we could work this some way so that I could teach at nights, I would be more than interested. And I'd have done it for nothing.
Right.
But there was a salary. And we did that. Well, of course, at home, I would make notes, class preparation, and everything else to deliver my lectures and things in school. I was on the faculty at Shepherd, and Sue would be right there while I was making the notes, and she would see me, be with me as I made up the exams and everything else. She knew all this stuff. She knew that coursework. She picked it up more rapidly than the students in the class did. She was good.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing she was, because I traveled. And I sometimes managed to travel at times when they had exams. And she had to go into the class and administer the examination. She never gave a lecture or anything to the class, but she did go in and, all right, you've got this much time, this is what you do. And she was great. Baseball, basketball, it didn't make any difference. Teaching, like falling off a log. She knew, from living with me, she knew more about it than I could ever teach a class of a freshman, you know. Arbutus was an interesting place. It was in all the places that we owned homes and lived. We made good friends there. And we did a lot of interesting things, and it was an interesting place to live, constructive. It was a good church that we belonged to. Our kids grew a great deal in that church. They had a Little League baseball set up, second to none that I've ever seen, or been associated with anyway. But they had a junior high school or elementary school that's set up on the property, and this great big, I'll bet there were 400 acres out behind. And the first baseball field was on the upper level where you came out of the school, and they had a complete field up there. You went down to a second level, and they had a field here, and they had one around the past center field. It was down here, and then down on the flat ground, you had room for a senior Little League baseball field at one end and two Little League fields scattered around down below. So it was one facility, but you would be having a slew of Little League games going on there. I remember one instance at the beginning of the season. they'd have a parade, opening day parade they would have. And all of the teams would get in uniform and get in a group with their own teams and everything, and they paraded it down Main Street. And this parade drew a lot of people because it was a good parade and for a good reason. I traveled a great deal. And I was the coach of the basketball team, or that baseball team. And I've seen her, and people have told me that they'd see the car park out on the highway. And Sue opened the trunk and take out a bag full of bats and balls or whatever that had to be covered. They'd take it out of the car, close the lid, put those things on her shoulder, come wandering across the outfield, and she would conduct the practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. She used to do that with me. She did it when I was coaching a basketball team. She knew these sports. Her mother loved the sports. And they actually, the two of them, had season tickets to the Birmingham Baron baseball team. So that, and again, this is another interesting little incident. She said, we'll go to, and a learning institute for me. She said, we'll take my ticket and Mom's ticket, and we'll go to the baseball game. It's a nice little box right down on the field. And she said, we'll go to the Birmingham game. I don't know who some of the players might have been, but they were probably many of them in the major leagues before the season was over.
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, we went to the ball game. And here I was sitting with Sue. And the ball players out on the field recognized Sue. And they saw that somebody was missing. And they would come over and say, Sue, where's Mama? And she said, she gave up her ticket so that Fred could come to this ball game with me. Oh, you give her our regards and tell her we missed her and everything else. I found out that they had season tickets for years.
Yeah.
And this is the first game that her mother had missed in years. She was always there. She knew all of those ball players. Some of those ball players actually came up to the house. So Sue's mother was a good cook and a good person. And they would come up there and just enjoy time with Sue and her mother. And so she was acclimated to sports, and she got it honestly. And so she became coach, counselor, everything else.
And wherever you guys have gone, there have been people who called you Mom and Dad.
Yep. Yep, that impresses me, particularly Mom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she had a way of being a people magnet.
Yeah.
Adults as well as the kids that you brought home from college. Yeah. Yeah, we'll go over and we could stay with Mom.
Mm-hmm.
Mom and Dad.
Yeah. Whether we were home or not.
Yeah. At the time that Uncle Buster was killed, and we had a house full of you people, you and I. And we didn't have any qualms about picking up and going down to the funeral.
Mm-hmm.
And we told just you that we were leaving and why. And we didn't believe it when we came back and walked into that house. There wasn't a dirty spot in it. They had cleaned places that we hadn't cleaned in a month.
Mm-hmm.
And no, they'd taken care of it. And we knew that it would be available for them the next time they came and needed a place to sleep. Yeah. When they started coming, they didn't have enough money to stay anywhere. Went home again after an hour or two.
Carpet of college kids in the basement.
Yeah. The lucky ones claimed the couch.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one night in particular, we were camped out and each of us had our sleeping bag. And two of our boys got into a ruckus. I said, Steve, I guess it was Charlie, he got in an argument with. And I said, what is the ruckus all about? Steve is not breathing right. Charlie couldn't stand that.
I believe he even told me to stop breathing at one point.
But it was a good place, and again, we as a family did it together. And Mike was an afterthought. He'll come later. But that was one of the trips that we took up there. Slept under the stars, and Steve couldn't breathe right. He learned that night, and I never heard anybody get on him after that. But Steve, as one of his first parades, they were teaching him what you do in a parade. They said you go straight on down and you stay and don't go wandering off. Well, that's fine. He said, you just follow the middle line in the highway here. And everybody said, how come Steve just keeps his head down, marching along there in this parade? Well, we found out afterward, he said, well, I was following that line in the middle of the road, and he did all the way through the parade. He walked with his head down and his eyes glued to that line.
I have always been easy to coach.
Yeah.
You tell me to do it, I'm going to do it.
So this was opening day, and it was a big occasion. And I can remember Steve turned into really a pretty good baseball player in Little League. And I remember one day I was coaching my team down on one of the lower levels, and the baseballs kept flying over our heads. They'd come from the field up above. Somebody would hit it hard enough to come on down to our field. And boy, after that happened 2 or 3 times, I said, Steve, it's got to be getting bad up there. A ball like that coming out, flying off the field entirely. But
so slow, I got a triple out of it.
yeah, yeah, you were kind of dumpy in the rear.
Oh, hit it a mile, stop at third base.
But